Anatomy can be pretty overwhelming. You look at those charts with 600 muscles labeled in Latin and then your head just explodes. I'll never learn all this. Well, here's the good news. You really don't need to. I'm Mark. I've worked for over 20 years drawing characters professionally. And what's obvious to me now that wasn't when I was just starting is that you really don't need to memorize all the muscles to draw convincing anatomy. You just need to simplify it down to shapes that your brain can actually handle. So today I'm showing you how to break down the entire human body in very simple, basic shapes that anybody can draw. No muscle memorization, no biology class, just simple shapes that make your characters look believable. By the end of this, you'll be able to draw the human body from different angles using shapes that you already probably know how to draw. And if you don't know, well, I'll just show you. I'll even give you what I consider the best exercise to practice this stuff. The same one I give to students on my art program. All right, let's jump right in. Woo! Here's why most beginners fail at anatomy. To start with this, full muscle charts. Memorizing things like the sternomastoid, the brachioradialis, the vastus lateralis. Your brain would see this and go, nope, too much information, I'm out. But here's what experienced artists actually do when we draw. We don't think about individual muscles, we think about shapes, groups, and volumes. And if you have the same approach, you're pretty advanced. When I draw an arm, I'm not thinking, okay, the biceps has 2 heads, the brachialis sits underneath, the triceps has 3 heads. No, instead I'm thinking sphere for the shoulder, cylinder for the upper arm, sphere for the elbow, cylinder for the forearm. You know, that's it, just simple geometric shapes, and very few of them too. And it looks like an arm. The secret to learning anatomy fast is to start with the shapes that create the silhouette. That'll get you to 80% of the way there. And then you can learn the details later. You know, that last 20% when you actually need them. But for a lot of characters, you actually don't need that last 20%. You might need like 1 to 5%. Just hints of anatomy and your character will look pretty good. So let me show you exactly how this works. We'll start simple with the head. In its simplest form, it'll be this upside down egg shape that I create with a sphere and then attach a jaw to it, like this U shape. Combined, it should be longer than it's wide, around maybe like 1.5 times its width, you know, narrower at the bottom where the jaw is, and slightly wider at the top where the skull is. Everything else, the eyes, the nose, the mouth, the ears, those are just details that we add to the egg later. But the egg gives us the structure. And from any angle, if your egg looks solid, your head will look pretty solid too. You know, as humans, we tend to look at bigger shapes first and then focus on the details second. So you should approach how you draw it the same way. From this side, it'll be a little different, maybe like the same shape, but you can see the egg shape is slightly tilted back. So to start off, like practice those 2 angles a lot until it gets significantly easier to draw. Then you can create these in-between angles to improve further. But really, we're just talking about one shape here. So master this, or don't need to master it, but get, you know, comfortable with it before you worry about facial features or skull anatomy. And it won't take you months to get there, right? It'll go pretty quick with some practice. And this is the foundation that everything else builds on. Now the torso, and this is where a lot of beginners really struggle because there's so much going on, like the pectoral muscles, the abs, the shoulders, the back muscles. Forget all of that for now. 2 shapes only. Shape number 1 is going to be the rib cage. So think of it as an egg again. So from the front, it'll look very similar, but this time it's slightly flattened if you were to look at it from the side. So I think it helps to cut it in half vertically too. And that line here will be completely straight if the character is facing us head on, you know, but that usually doesn't look too good. So try curving it just a bit in either direction to suggest a tiny bit of perspective. Or you could also just not draw the line. I'm just getting a little carried away here, adding a bunch of details, but you know, don't have to do that. And then the shape number 2 is going to be for the pelvis. For guys, this is going to be basically just a box. And for women, maybe more of a trapezium. And I'm generalizing, obviously. And you can draw these shapes really easily by starting from the front and back faces, you know, like offsetting them just a little bit like this, and then connecting all the corners and erasing the extra lines here that we wouldn't really see because they're like underneath or behind the object. See that? And notice how when I offset them, I drew the back face in the direction opposite to the curve of my torso. Now this will just make sure that your character is standing straight, but if you do the reverse like this, it'll just seem like the torso is twisted instead. And it's possible, right? We can rotate our torso independently from the pelvis, But wait, am I losing some of you? You know what? Just ignore all that perspective stuff and just draw your egg in your box however you like. It'll still look great. But yeah, anyway, this is the torso. Two shapes. Ribcage sits on top and the pelvis sits on the bottom. And then you should leave a small gap between them, you know, something that's about like half roughly the height of the pelvis box. And that's gonna be your waist. And if you can draw these two shapes at different angles and make them look 3D, well, you can draw any torso pose. You might be wondering about the abs. Well, those are just details that we add on top later. Same with the chest muscles, details. The obliques, details. First, you'll want to nail the two main volumes. Everything else will just be decoration. All right, arms and legs. Now, these are actually all done the same way. Every limb follows the same pattern. We'll start with a sphere, then a cylinder, another sphere, another cylinder, and another sphere. And then let's just put a box for the hand for now. And if we move down to the legs, well, it'll be the same thing. The sphere for the hip joint, a cylinder for the thigh,
another sphere for the knee, another cylinder for the lower leg, and then a wedge or like a triangle for the foot.
Same pattern every time. Once you understand one limb, you understand them all. And real quick, here's a tip for drawing convincing cylinders. Just start with an ellipse, seen at an angle, right? So it'll almost look like a grain of rice. And hey, I know this is pretty basic stuff, right? For a lot of you, I'm sure. But you know, maybe this helps somebody that's trying to do that for the first time. But yeah, what I'm doing here is just drawing the same exact ellipse, but a little bit lower, and then connecting the edges. And there's your cylinder. Isn't that cute? Now here's a quick tip that makes this instantly better. The cylinders aren't perfectly round. They're actually slightly tapered. So the upper arm is thicker at the shoulder, thinner at the elbow. The forearm is thicker at the elbow, thinner at the wrist, and the same idea for the leg. So just draw that bottom ellipse a tad smaller when you draw your cylinders, and you should be looking pretty good. Like I said, we're focused on the shapes that make up the silhouette. And check this out. If we black out all of these and place them in the right position, we get a pretty believable silhouette, right? Now, we still have to go over the proportions. But before we do that, I think the best way to practice this stuff is what I've talked about at the beginning of the class. The same exercise my students do when they go through my art program. First, you'll want to find a bunch of reference photos of people standing, preferably not wearing much, and we'll just draw the same shape over the character on a different layer. Here we can reduce the opacity to make it easier to see, and draw the same shapes that we talked about for every body part. When you hide the reference, you should be left with mannequins in correct proportions. Eventually, as you get better, you'll be able to try drawing these shapes but without the reference directly underneath, instead placing it next to your canvas maybe. And before we look at the whole body assembled, if you'd like to join a huge gang of like-minded artists all working towards the same goal of taking their art to the next level, you should check out the #1 art program in the entire world with a link in the video description. Now, you don't need it, to be fair. I have so much free content on the channel already that should be enough to take you from zero to professional artist if you have a lot of discipline and you can kind of figure out the structure yourself. But if you feel like you need help with that, like knowing exactly what to do in what order to maximize your potential gains, or maybe if you're looking for classes that are more in-depth, that cover a wider range of topics with assignments, a week-by-week progression system so that you're never left wondering what you should be doing next. Also, a huge Discord community with a ton of passionate artists, and a teacher who's been teaching for over a decade, who also happens to be a professional artist with over 20 years of experience. I think you should check it out, especially with the huge discount we have going on right now for the New Year sale, but it's going until the end of the month only, so I don't want you to miss out on this if you've been considering it. Alright, back to our character. Now, of course, shapes are useless if our body proportions look like garbage. But proportions are actually way easier than you think. Here are the only measurements that you really need to memorize. The head guideline. Most characters are going to be 6 to 8 heads tall. Use the heads as your measuring tool for everything. The halfway guideline. The crutch is halfway down the body, so legs will start there. This means that the legs are about half your total height. The arm guideline. When your arms hang at your sides, the hands should roughly line up with your crutch. And then the upper-lower guideline. Upper arms are slightly longer than forearms, and upper legs are also slightly longer than lower legs. Not by much, but enough to matter. That's it. 4 guidelines. If you follow those, your proportions should always look believable, even if your anatomy is kinda, so-so. Because most beginner anatomy mistakes aren't really anatomy mistakes, they're proportion mistakes. So get those ratios right and your characters will instantly look way better. So let's put this system to work with a full character. I'll draw someone in a simple standing pose using only the shapes that we talked about. So let's start with the egg head. This is going to set my scale. Now I can mark my total height, about 7 heads tall, let's say. Draw the ribcage egg now, split down the middle and pointing to the right just a little bit. Now I can draw the pelvis box, slightly wider at the bottom for a female character, and then add the limbs, cylinders and spheres following the pattern. The total time for this, maybe 2 minutes if I drop my pen a few times, and I have a solid foundation. Now watch, I can draw the same character in a completely different pose using the exact same shapes, just rotated differently. Obviously, that's trickier to do, but we're using the same Lego blocks, so it should be much easier to do than without. And this is the power of shape-based construction. You're not copying poses anymore, you're building them. Once you have this foundation solid, then you start thinking about the muscles, because now you have a framework to attach them to. Now here's just a little warning maybe, because a lot of people will mess this up. Like if you learn the system, you'll get maybe excited, and then you'll want to immediately start to draw a character doing a backflip in a complex perspective. I wouldn't do that. Start simple, draw characters that are just standing, draw them sitting at most, draw them walking, master those shapes in simple poses first. Once they become more automatic, and they will with practice, then start pushing into more complex poses, and then start adding detailed anatomy if your characters need it. And if they do need it, well, I actually made a class going over the entire body anatomy in under 10 minutes, going over the whole skeleton and all the surface muscles of the body in great detail. Now, it'll be a lot if you're not comfortable with the stuff that we've just seen in this particular class, but if you are, actually even if you aren't, head over there next and make sure that you save the class for future reference because you'll likely need it. I guarantee it'll be super helpful. The link will be up on screen here in a second. I'll see you there.